Well, hello and welcome to our Center for Health Technology and Innovation webinar series. My name is Pat Dunn. The topic for today's discussion is Revolutionizing Cardiology, the Future of Imaging Innovations. And we hope today, of all days, this conversation will be a welcome break from whatever else is in your inbox and on your feeds. So today we're joined by Dr. Kate Hanneman from the University of Toronto, Dr. Mike McConnell from Stanford University. Mike is a member of our Health Tech Advisory Group. He's actually been a member since its inception, dating back well over a decade. And also Georgi Kadrev, who is the CEO of Kelvin Health. Kelvin is a member of the Center for Health Technology and Innovations Innovators Network. So let's start with some brief introductions. So Kate, would you like to begin?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a cardiac radiologist. I practice at the University of Toronto, mostly at the Cardiac Center located at Toronto General. I'm the Vice Chair of Research in the Department of Medical Imaging at the University of Toronto, and I did do my fellowship training at Stanford. So I had the pleasure of working with Dr. McConnell a little while ago, and it's my pleasure to be here today.
Great. And next we'll go to Dr. McConnell. Mike?
Thanks, Pat. Hi, Kate. Good to see you. So I'm a clinical professor at Stanford in cardiovascular medicine, where I still practice part-time in preventive cardiology and cardiovascular imaging. I used to run the advanced imaging program and preventive cardiology clinic there. But I spent a lot of the last, as Pat alluded to, part of the Health Tech Advisory Group since 2014. I'm working in this sort of digital health tech space. And so I've worked at Verily and Google, and then most recently have helped several startups. So I'm currently Chief Health Officer for Toku, which I'll talk a bit about in this context. So pleasure to be here.
Great. And finally, George.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. My background is very technical. I've been running into computer vision basically since I remember myself. And then I started one company more than 12 years ago, which has nothing to do with medicine or with healthcare. And it went quite successful in commercial terms. But what we felt as a calling is how these technologies for image recognition, AI, can be applied in healthcare. And this is something that I'm after with Kelvin Health in the last 4 years. In the last 2 years, with exclusive focus on cardiovascular diagnostics, especially in the peripheral arterial disease space. And it's a pleasure to share some experience and findings that we have.
Great, thank you. So as always with the American Heart Association, we're very sensitive to making sure we're not endorsing any specific products. But we do really want to have a lively, engaged conversation really about the technology. So just keep that in mind as we're talking, to really focus on the science and the technology and less about any specific products. But with that being said, and we'll start with Kate. Just what are you seeing in the area of imaging that's really exciting and interesting to you?
I love this question, and I feel like we could probably all talk for an entire day on this. So I really tried to focus what I wanted to start with into kind of a couple of big buckets. I think the innovation in cardiac imaging really spans the entire patient experience. And I think that's important to highlight. It's not just about the latest and greatest and most beautiful images that we could acquire, but really we really need to start to think all the way from selecting the right test. And I think there's some incredible innovation, largely driven by some of the AI models in terms of integrating information from our vast electronic health records, all of the lab tests that we have, the clinical history that our referring clinicians might put in, really to try to help us guide and select the best test for the patient so they're not having multiple tests to get a diagnosis. On the technical development side, as we might initially think about it in terms of new imaging techniques, I think there's a ton of exciting data coming out on the molecular imaging side. So new radio tracers helping us to understand what's going on at a pathophysiologic level and hopefully guiding management. And one example of that, and we can maybe do a deeper dive later, are some of the molecular imaging agents that have been applied in the heart. looking at fibroblast activation. So trying to understand what's happening after someone has a heart attack or a myocardial infarction, or some of the non-ischemic cardiomyopathies, really understanding what's happening at the tissue level. And then I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation in terms of risk prediction, identifying who is at risk. So once we know someone has a disease, maybe they have multiple imaging tests to measure their aortic size. This is just one example. We know that kind of the main risk predictor we're still using or largely relying on is imperfect, the aortic size. It identifies some patients, but not all of them. And so I think there's been a tremendous amount of innovation in terms of integrating all of the incredible data that is in all the pixels on the images that maybe we're already acquiring, but we're just not extracting that. So looking at alternate ways to extract data, again, AI, radiomics, some of the more advanced imaging techniques like 4D flow, integrating the hemodynamic parameters with anatomy in terms of improving our ability to identify who's at risk, who needs intervention, who might need surgery, or even closer monitoring. So hopefully that kind of gives you a flavor of the innovation, really, again, spanning the entire patient experience.
That's amazing. I'll have to have Mike and George explain that to me, what you just said, but it sounded amazing. So, Mike, same question. What is interesting and exciting for you in the area of imaging?
Well, Kate covered a lot, so I'll probably focus an area that I probably put most of my attention recently, which I think Eric Topol and others have coined as this opportunistic imaging. I really love marrying imaging and prevention. So a lot of my goal is how do we scale up prevention so a lot more people get access to the latest guideline-based preventive care, given cardiovascular disease still number one. And really the concept is there are many imaging technologies that are used in daily clinical practice that have, I think, as Kate alluded to, have a lot more information beyond the primary thing that it's intended to look at. I'll talk about one, I'll talk about what's called oculomics. The other area is sort of opportunistic use of coronary calcium or chest CT, which can see many things, but as Kate said, we could all keep talking forever. If there's time, I can come back to that one because colleagues at Stanford have really advanced that field a lot. So the oculomics idea, actually, when I was at Google in 2018, they had a big program using AI retinal images for detecting diabetic retinopathy, so leading cause of blindness. There aren't enough ophthalmologists in the world to have access to that. So that started with, showing that AI could really match retinal specialists in detecting advanced diabetic retinopathy. And that several companies have taken that through the FDA, and it's really the first, and I think I'm told still only, sort of autonomous diagnosis. So it doesn't require re-review of the images. And it's been implemented at Stanford in primary care, and it helps people have much more rapid access to retinal imaging. But the team at Google then thought, well, could we train it around all the different risk factors that go into risk for heart attack and stroke, our ASCVD risk score, or now our prevent risk score, and shows you the power of deep learning and machine learning, that it was just as good as the standard risk scores for predicting future heart attack and stroke. And so I've really wanted to see that turned into a product. And I think George can allude to this as well, the challenges of taking something that makes a great publication, but getting it into patients' hands. Often the technology can be the easier part. But, are you addressing an unmet clinical need? Is there a good product market fit? Can it fit in the workflow? Can you get paid for it? And can you make a sustainable business? Because if you can't have a sustainable business, then the product won't survive. So this is one of the things Toku has worked on, and we published in the Cardiovascular Digital Health Journal using retinal AI. So when you come to, say, your optometrist and get a routine retinal image, the idea that you can have your cardiovascular risk assessed, really with the goal of saying not everybody's getting their risk assessed. They may not be seeing their primary care doctor, and there are millions and millions of retinal images done every year in the United States alone. And can we help identify folks who are at increased risk so that they get, a good evaluation and get on preventive therapy? So that's an area really trying to use this opportunistic imaging to let many more people be aware of their cardiovascular risk and hopefully, help then prevent, catch early and prevent.
Great. Well, George, we know what's interesting and exciting to you, but why don't you, let's just start with, tell us about your technology. And again, don't talk about the product, don't talk about, think of it from a scientific perspective. That's really your audience here, but would love to hear more about your technology.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Pat. So, for us, as I briefly shared before, we're a technology-driven company that basically has been doing research in image recognition for many years. And we deliberately stayed aside up until the start of Kelvin Health as a spin-off project. We were staying aside from the medical space in general because it brings so much responsibility, and a lot of the processes there are much slower. And of course, this comes with reason. This comes with scientific and ethical reasons. But we got so excited by multiple factors that we jumped, let's say, this imaginary fence that we had in our head, and we decided that if you have nowadays the technologies for image recognition in general in any space are so advanced, they can read to the micro level of many things as long as you have the pixels as they said. So we decided if we can couple our experience in image recognition and the availability of very portable hardware, and I'm saying that in the context that we are not a hardware company, we are a software venture that basically reads the input from a hardware. But the fact is that nowadays we have thermal cameras that are that small. I mean, maybe you don't see this due to the fogging, but this is something very portable. And if you have this and you can couple it with the state of the art of artificial intelligence, and then assess based on the thermal signal, or let's say the thermal footprint of the body, what kind of anomalies might be there. And of course, if you can validate this with a lot of scientific validation and patient observations, it's very exciting what it can achieve. Because, the overall even since the time of Hippocrates, the correlation between different processes of our body and how this heat is distributed in the body for whatever reason, inflammation, sepsis, spasms, and obviously vascular problems, especially arterial problems, this correlation is validated to be properly shown on the surface of the body, because obviously this hardware is capturing the heat of the surface of the body. This brings a huge potential to basically provide very accessible care because of the level of precision and automation that the AI can bring. And at the same time, the portability, the accessibility, and the eventual non-invasiveness of such methods. So this is what is basically making me wake up every morning out of bed with a lot of excitement about what we do. And I'm not saying this, to speculate or to oversell anything. Just the ability to have something portable and precise to assist the specialist is something that is really a mission for us.
That's great. Thank you. So you've all alluded to some of the challenges, and it can be from scientific challenges, technical challenges, reimbursement, adoption, cost. We'll get to AI in a little bit, but let's go back and start with Kate. What are some of the obstacles or things that need to be overcome for an emerging technology to really be a game changer? That it really becomes mainstream, it becomes adopted, it becomes part of guidelines, and it really has a significant impact in the care. So how do you go from that cool technology that is promising all the way to it's now state of the art?
I think this is so important, and I'll go back to something Mike said. It's a big leap from the exciting scientific publication to seeing a product that's really integrated within care pathways and ultimately guidelines for how we manage patients and so forth. And I think there are a couple hurdles, and of course we've all seen exciting papers that have not led to changes in how care is practiced clinically, at least not, in the short term, and not to be disparaging at all. And so I think, some of the challenges, one, you have to have a technology that works, and you need to understand what patient population it works in, what the indication is. And we've, seen this in AI where model might work really well when it's trained, maybe even on an external validation cohort if it was acquired on a similar imaging vendor, for example. And we have all seen this trying to implement, AI tools. Again, this is just one example, but same principle applies to a lot of these technologies. You apply it in a different patient population, or even slightly different, vendor equipment was used to acquire the images, and it really does not perform as well. So there's a big leap there in terms of the development and the testing and the validation, making sure it actually works in real world. Of course, there's other hurdles in terms of, the regulatory process, FDA, and of course, in Canada, we have Health Canada. We tend to fall behind, and so, but European markets and so forth, also very different. But really, I think, we also have to have the capacity to deliver the care, to acquire the images, if that's what we're talking about here, or analyze them. And there are many challenges across the board that we need to think about if we're talking about deploying a new imaging technology, unless it's what George is talking about, something you can do kind of in your office. Well, we have a massive technologist shortage. So yeah, it would be great if we had a new imaging test and we said everyone deserves to have this. Right now we literally would not have the capacity to acquire the images or analyze them. So those are kind of, again, I really wanted to touch on everything across the entire patient spectrum, because it's not just one hurdle or one challenge. And really, I'm so inspired by the people that have made this leap from academics and both of you in terms of really trying to get these cool products into care pathways to benefit patients.
Thanks, Kate. So Mike, maybe just to expand upon that, maybe with some of the specific companies or even some of the work you're doing at Stanford, what are some of the barriers that you have to overcome to really get to that next level?
Yeah, so I think Kate identified a really important issue, particularly when you're using AI, machine learning technologies, is that they're often first validated, trained on specific populations, but then you want to deploy in the real world. And so I think, one of the things that the FDA has really been very transparent about is that for AI-based products, and they've approved now, I think they just updated their list. I think there are over 1,000 FDA cleared products that involve AI or ML. And the vast majority are in radiology, and the number 2 category is cardiology. So it's very fitting for this discussion. But importantly, they really want to see largely prospective data in populations that are your intended population in the United States, and where there's geographic diversity, demographic diversity, because, as Kate indicated, if it's trained on a specific data set and then applied to another, it may not work adequately. So I think that is one of the big hurdles, but I think it's a very important hurdle to make sure that when it actually is deployed in the real world, that it works for everyone. And I think I touched on the others, which is often then to create a sustainable business, it really has to fit into a provider workflow. So for example, if we're deploying with optometry has a very rapid sort of sequence of steps that they go through when they see their patients. And so you need something that can work very quickly. Thankfully, with computational power, you can get an AI result usually within a minute or less. And then to provide and Toku's part of the AHA Innovators Program as well, and work with the AHA to make sure that the language and information that's provided both to the clinician and to the patient, follows guidelines and follows the science. And then the last part is probably often the most challenging, is in terms of reimbursement and then a sustainable business model so that you can, the whole point is to scale so that you can provide as many people with the benefits of the product as possible. And that's where I'm less of an expert, but work with folks on the business side and reimbursement side just to see how we can make this a sustainable business. So
great. And George, again, without getting too far into the weeds, without getting too much into your business plan, so maybe focus again really on more of the scientific and technical challenges. But what are some of the challenges that you've had to overcome to get your technology even to where it is now? And what do you see, moving forward as some of those key challenges?
Yeah, I think in general, for practically any medical device or diagnostic device, is generating enough evidence, obviously. And we focused a lot on doing this in Europe. We performed pretty extensive observational studies. And now expanding this to the US, we spent the last 10 months, practically since the beginning of this year, to make sure that we very well understand the dynamics of the healthcare systems and where exactly does this fit. And I'm saying that because, at first, because this is our first health venture, as I said, and we didn't even know about many of the steps or the sub-steps. So just understanding the whole puzzle on how to validate the solution. And when I say evidence, I'm not just talking about pure patient evidence. I'm talking about evidences about the process, the patient outcome impact, the economic impact of these things, because at the end of the day, they require the fidelity of the specialists who will be using them, or the primary care professionals. And of course, there is this dynamic that we faced, again, for the first time about 2 years ago, when we get real about actually validating this as a medical device, is this balance between how general, or let's say how wide applicable you want to be, and how much effort this is going to take. So just as an example, if you want to assist with a solution like ours, if you want to assist the specialist, you have a certain type of claims, and they might be even more technologically challenging to reach. But at the same time, this requires a more focused, specific patient population that is already, let's say, symptomatic or goes to the doctor. If you want to apply to the specific secondary care doctor, the vascular specialist, but if you want to apply this in primary care, which can potentially be very impactful if you can enable wide screening of people, then you need a different type of population, because you don't want to report false positives, for example. You don't want to scare people away. And something that adds a bit more flavor, spicy flavor to that, I can tell, is that thermography just historically has a bad name in the breast cancer clinical community, because some people were using this without regulatory clearance, without enough evidence, and just, either giving false positives or false negatives, like either saying to people who actually have breast cancer, they're no problem, or they scare away people who don't have. And we definitely decided since the very beginning of this project, we want to be very meticulous about generating very detailed evidence across different populations, comorbidities, etc. And even when you say what's the challenge, I'm not actually feeling this as a challenge. It's practically a challenge, but it's a very interesting research work and an ambitious one, I believe, to be as close to the perfect precision of this technology as possible, something that we have still a long way to go. But we feel very excited about the opportunity to do as massive studies as possible, and to actually be absolutely sure and clear for ourselves that it is first precise in terms of sensitivity and specificity, then actually improve the patient outcome, and of course leads to some significant cost savings both for the patient and the healthcare system. This is an exciting process. It takes some time, but we're here to stay basically and want to go all the way to have a very strong claims about that, supported with evidence in all three aspects of it.
Great. You've all mentioned AI in some form or other, and frankly, it's hard to have a conversation these days without mentioning AI. It seems to have invaded everything that we do. So let's start with George. Could you talk a little bit about how AI either impacts or is integrated into your technology?
Yeah, I love the topic of AI, and actually something that I typically like to do as an introduction to that is demystifying AI. Because as a technical person, I've been basically into AI before it was modern. I was like basically prototyping things since 1994, which was before the second coming of AI. And then we witnessed a lot of different things happening there. But to me, AI in its current most widespread form of machine learning, or even more of the so-called supervised machine learning, it's just about collecting enough data. And the good thing about this is that actually this is what anyway studies are supposed to do. Of course, there's a difference in the amount of data that is required because you want to provide robustness of those algorithms. But in our case, back to your question, to be too verbose, our solution is practically all AI. And I'm not talking that we do everything in AI because there are many different aspects, like Kate mentioned, for example, pulling data from electronic health records, etc. These are not the things that we do. We focused very narrow down to just recognizing images and anomalies in the images. So in our case, this means after taking a thermogram of the patient and having then a very detailed arterial zone based annotation of this image based on the traditional examinations that have been done to the patient anyway, we just correlate those. We segment the different zones of the thermogram to identify the different arterial zones from different perspectives. And then we correlate this with, let's say, the results from angiography, typically X-ray angiography, eventually even ABI index or Doppler ultrasound. But we use, of course, the angiography as the gold standard. So collecting these amounts of data that I briefly mentioned about, we can build this visual to actual correlation. So if this thing here is with some specific anomaly in the thermal aspect of it, as I said, is surface temperature, and we can correlate this to, let's say, low ABI index or to specific problem that has been detected by the sonographer, or even more by the invasive X-ray angiography examination, catheter X-ray angiography, and we can build enough samples of both healthy and unhealthy zones, healthy and unhealthy patients, and then we can provide a very robust AI solution given that we have enough data. So that's what we are after, to build these data sets with as many patients as possible, different conditions, comorbidities, and then automate the process of suggesting or evaluating the arterial zone perfusion status based on that. That's the goal. That's what we are after. And that's where the clinical community and the patients, of course, are very important to support these studies and to collect as much data as possible.
Excellent. So Mike, I know you've been involved in AI, in multiple types of applications. I know Stanford has really been a leader in AI. So, how is AI impacting your world?
Yeah, so as George said, the machine learning really is based on very large data sets, and for the retinal imaging, we have hundreds of thousands of images de-identified but linked with health records, and that's where we can develop ways to predict cardiovascular, actually the full sort of cardio-kidney metabolic syndrome spectrum per the AHA's recent advisory. So predicting cardiovascular risk, kidney disease risk, metabolic and diabetes status. I think the Stanford example I wanted to mention, which has a few different steps, but is very much a real world implementation where, when someone gets a chest CT, I think years ago, when someone would get admitted and they happened to get, say, for a chest pain and their PE exam, chest CT was negative for pulmonary embolism. But I would take the house staff and go look and say, well, do we see coronary calcification? Because if you're in a rule out, chest pain rule out, that would totally change your pretest probability of. So, now colleagues at Stanford have developed an AI algorithm that will take a chest CT scan and generate a coronary calcium score. And then the real world application was then that those images with that information was then sent both to the patient and to the ordering provider. And what they found was the vast majority of patients were not on appropriate cardiovascular preventive therapy, and showing them their images and their physician the images led to a big jump in appropriate guideline-based preventive care, and patients seeing their own images. They were also much more likely to stay on their preventive therapy, when followed up later. So I think this, is good evidence that there are very positive, impactful real-world applications of this. And the last thing I'll mention, we just published as part of the MESA data set that using AI to further analyze the coronary calcium scan, you can actually look at all the different chamber volumes. So not only was it using the AI very predictive of future heart attack and stroke, but also was predictive of future heart failure and atrial fibrillation. So the idea that there is a ton of information, all those images that Kate is looking through with thousands and thousands of slices, really has a wealth of images or wealth of information that we're really just starting to see the broader impact of using all of it in a very informed way to help our patients.
Great. And Kate, I know the University of Toronto has also been a leader in AI, machine learning. You have a brand new Nobel laureate from your institution. So again, how is AI impacting your world?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. And I just want to emphasize, something we talked about at the very beginning, that I think this spans the entire patient experience. So, often when we think about AI and cardiac imaging, I think people immediately jump to the pixel-based or image-based AI. Like Mike talked about, there has been tremendous work in this space, definitely led by the team at Stanford, including, Kurt Langlotz and so forth, and many others. And I just want to acknowledge, the work that, really laid a foundation for many other AI algorithms, and those are incredibly powerful. But really, I think AI, allows us to do things even before and after the imaging. And I want to emphasize that, because I think sometimes those other parts of the patient experience, which are incredibly important, might get overlooked. So again, selecting the right test, lots of work on that. Protocoling our imaging studies. So, that's something that we still in many cases do manually. So looking at the data, looking at the order, maybe pulling up the electronic patient record, spending all that time, and then, deciding, okay, well, we'll do these sequences in this patient and so forth. Lots of work being done on automating all of that. So one, saving us time, hopefully allowing us to, spend our human brain power on things that more directly impact patient care positively, but also, standardizing things, which has a tremendous benefit. All the way to the risk prediction, and Mike alluded to that, and I think that's really important. So either, trying to identify risk markers that we already know, like coronary calcium, in an opportunistic way, an imaging that was acquired for another reason, or direct risk prediction from the images, not even kind of trying to go to an intermediary risk marker that we know of, like coronary calcium, but literally just taking the pixels, analyzing them, allowing AI to, directly say, this is the patient's risk of a heart failure event in a year, or this is the patient's risk of having a fall, identifying frailty. So some of these cardiometabolic risk factors that Mike mentioned are incredibly important, and they work together. So where I see this going, and I hope I am still looking at thousands of images 10 years from now, but absolutely, I think AI will be pre-analyzing the images, probably pre-generating a report for us, and we will be interacting with that one, confirming, that this makes sense, making changes, of course, and again, spending more time in those higher level functions. And I just want to give one example of where AI has absolutely changed our clinical workflows, cardiac imagers. 10 years ago when I was at Stanford, we spent a long time drawing circles, trying to quantify how much blood was in the heart, how well it was beating. And I'm not joking. This really took a long time, to contour each image. And this is, within the last 10 years, this is one click now. We went from first, okay, it was the left ventricle, which is kind of an easier ventricle to quantify, to you still had to quantify, you still had to draw circles on the right ventricle, which looks a little bit weird. And now essentially it's one click. We've even moved beyond kind of the traditional markers, again, the volumes and the function that we, would have normally reported, to strain is basically one click, quantifying the myocardial tissue, almost one click. And that is largely driven by AI. And those are all commercially available. So that is an actual application of AI that has completely changed how our workflow has worked, and in my opinion, for the better.
That's great. Amazing. So we're going to open up the Q&A to the audience. So if people have questions, you can type those in, and then we will distribute those questions to our panelists while those questions are getting loaded up. So Mike, I know you're part of a main stage program at Scientific Sessions, which is next weekend. It's called Health Technology's Impact on Cardiology Over the Last 100 Years and what the future holds. So could you give us maybe a little teaser? Don't give us your presentation, but tease it up for those of you that are going to sessions.
Sure. Yeah, no, it'll be a fun and challenging task. I think we're each given about 10 or 11 minutes to try and summarize 100 years. But I have the exciting opportunity to try and be a little bit more sort of looking at that history. The other speakers will touch upon areas including AI, imaging, electrophysiology, coronary intervention, and I think there'll also be a closing part, sort of very much where is the future headed. So and probably a number of themes similar to what we were talking about today. Yeah, I think I guess as probably the oldest of the panel members here, it's been an incredibly exciting journey for me so probably one of the topics will be imaging, going through that technology evolution where, we couldn't get an MRI image of the heart without it all being blurred and then, within a few short years, not only being able to image coronaries, but then able to image plaques in your coronaries, then being able to image inflamed plaques in your coronaries. So, and there have been similar developments. I think the other one that's a favorite for me is before I decided to go into medicine, worked a couple of summers in Medtronic, and we take pacemakers so for granted now, but the history, of it starting out in an engineer's garage and, walking it over to the University of Minnesota and a day later being put on a patient as really the first wearable, portable cardiac device that, and the closed loop system, right? It would monitor for, in the beginning, not so much, it would just pace, but then set up where it would monitor, and then it would monitor your physical activity and adjust there. And so that technology, and obviously, Google worked with the Fitbit team and similar to Apple, the the ability that now all this ECG or heartbeat monitoring on your wrist. So there really been some astounding innovations in the last 100 years that, you know, the AHA research and science has been a strong participant, advocate, and funder for. So, and as a prior recipient myself, very thankful. So.
Yeah, at the AHA National Center in Dallas, in the lobby is the office, literally the medical office of one of the AHA's founders, Dr. Paul Dudley White. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, you can see, you know, his ECG or EKG machine probably at the time. It kind of looks like an execution chair, but it probably still did its job. You know, it had a mercury column sphygmomanometer for blood pressure. It had one of those balance scales, but you know, it was still innovative, I'm sure, for its time. So it's, you know, so it's amazing stuff. So yeah, so Scientific Sessions is coming up. It's actually next weekend. AHA is celebrating its centennial. It's 100 years. AHA was formed back in 1924, so it's exciting for us. So maybe, you know, and let's start with the people who have the longest distance to travel. So George, tell us, you know, like what are you excited about at Scientific Sessions, both within the sessions, but also, you know, are there any favorite places that you like to go to in Chicago?
I'll definitely count on your advice on that and people like Kate who have been there many times, I believe. My first AHA Scientific Sessions was last year when it was in Philadelphia. And I was really amazed about the scale of the event because I've been in many events in Europe, sometimes across different topics, not only medical, entrepreneurial, etc. And there are typically, you know, 2,000-3,000 people, which is considered a huge event, and they're not focused on anything. With my first visit to the AHA, it was Scientific Sessions last year. It was really eye-opening how you can collect so many people and so much thought potential and energy in the same place, and they're all in the same research space. Broadly speaking, of course, there are many different aspects of cardiovascular and many different aspects of technology and innovation that can be applied there. Of course, the innovation pavilion is one of the exciting places for me, but this would be just think in my own bubble as a technology innovator guy. I definitely would like to visit a lot of the therapeutic area, I mean, of PAD section events. There was quite some last year. Maybe I still say that sometimes the peripheral arterial disease is a little bit on the periphery of cardiovascular disease, but like to see more and more of that. And people that are doing research in that area from different aspects, of course, like the pure medical aspects of it, treatment, diagnostics, if any, as we obviously fall in this space. And there were many different theaters across. I believe it will be the same this year. So any aspects of healthcare interesting for us, because as I said, we are relatively new to the space, and just 4 years of experience, despite a long technology experience before that. So we are still learning actively, and every conversation counts, especially at such kind of a focused event on a specific therapeutic area. Literally, I couldn't meet a person that I meet there and they won't be in some way instrumental to shaping our understanding of the space, etc. We even, one of the centers that we're about to start a pretty massive clinical research collaboration with, actually I met at the food market at AHA last year. So again, when the event is focused on a specific area and when people are bringing there the enthusiasm, the ambition, the mission to solve problems in the space, it's every conversation actually adds value, which is great. And this is not my experience with events, and I'm visiting events actively since 15 years. So as I said, not just in the space of medicine and cardiovascular. So super excited about that, and yeah, looking forward to the next weekend.
So keep in mind, there's a lot of fun things to do in Chicago outside of the exhibit hall and outside of sessions. If you've never been to Chicago, we'll have to get recommendations from Kate and Mike on that. Unfortunately, most of the food recommendations are probably not very heart healthy, but I think for one weekend, it's probably okay.
I'm also
So
a vegetarian, which might be challenging.
yeah, it might be challenging in Chicago. That's for sure. So I think technically Toronto is probably closer to Chicago than San Francisco, but since Kate, you have to cross an international border, we'll go to you next. What are you excited about both within the sessions, but also what are you excited about in Chicago?
As George said, I'm so lucky I get to spend a lot of time in Chicago. Our big radiology meetings there every year. And so I love Chicago. For those of you who haven't been, you're in for a treat. Both on a session side and a fun side. So, of course, we're leading up into the holiday season. Camas the Magnificent Mile. But really, the art scene in Chicago is unparalleled. So if you can see one thing, go to the Art Institute. It's really special. The Bean and Cloudgate, as it's actually known, are really special. I go see it every time in Millennium Park. It's worth a walk through. And then the food is phenomenal, George. We're going to connect after. I'm also plant-based or vegetarian, so you will have no problem. And I have some specific recommendations for you. I agree. The Chicago deep dish pizza, probably like worth a try, but definitely not on the heart healthy side. But I think it's a special treat. It's worthwhile. At sessions, I will be there, of course, as well. My home council is mostly CVRI, and I'll be talking about the link between environmental sustainability and cardiac imaging. This directly relates to a lot of what we talked about today, because of course we want to think about not only how to deliver care that's value-based and cost-effective, but also allows us to have a healthy planet for our children and so forth. So encourage you to come to that. And there's definitely some innovation that links into that, how we can use AI to be more efficient and of course environmentally sustainable. So really that's going to be the main focus for my stay at sessions, and I'm very excited. Again, both for the science, as we heard about, and for the experience in Chicago. One thing I wanted to add, and it ties into what we talked about before, and George mentioned something that I think was really, really important. And AHA has done such an amazing job in kind of supporting not only the innovation, as Mike talked about, the grants and so forth, and also very grateful for all of that. But George talked about the perception of imaging tests, and I think this is important. I was kind of mulling it over as we were talking, and this link between, not only do we have to convince clinicians to order an imaging test or use it or buy it or whatever it is, but patients are really, of course, ultimately, the customer, or however you want to think about it, that we're serving. And in the era of, shared decision making, like the difference between, 20 years ago, a doctor ordered a test and maybe a patient, they just did it. Maybe they didn't care if there was radiation or didn't know, and that wasn't even discussed. It's very different now. And so I think the perception, not only of clinicians, but patients, is really important when we're thinking about these technologies. And, probably that relates to the barriers and the hurdles, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we need to ensure communication is not just so sciencey and so data driven that people don't understand it. So I thought that was really important that George brought that up, somewhat tangentially, but really I just wanted to acknowledge it, that we really need to make sure we communicate in a way that is accessible to patients and of course are available to answer questions.
Great. And Mike, I know you were recently in Chicago. You're at the Chicago Marathon. I think you were there supporting a family member. But what are you excited about, both inside the sessions and outside the sessions?
Well, since you did sort of the preview, yeah, I'll start with that. I was just in Chicago. I have a daughter there who's in medical school, University of Illinois, Chicago, who's interested in becoming a pediatric cardiologist. But she, with my other daughter, both ran the Chicago Marathon together in support of and raised funds for the American Heart Association. So I was there, and that was super fun. And yeah, I think that whole area where they finished all along sort of the lake, they have great parks there and the art exhibits, as Kate mentioned. And then one of the things that, if the weather permits, it's very easy to, do the bike rental, sort of getting up and around Chicago is a lot of fun that way, because it is a big city, pretty spread out. And then the other on Magnificent Mile, definitely have to go in. This is the year to do it. You have to go into the Drake Hotel, which is where the AHA was founded. They have a classic, hotel and bar, and just to see the spot where it happened, so to speak. And yeah, I think food-wise, I grew up in New York with the thin pizza, but it is fun to do the deep dish, and obviously the standard deep dish is vegetarian, so you're okay there. Not completely vegan, but vegetarian. And but I think I want to try. They also have like some tavern style that I haven't tried that's there. I'd like to try all the different kinds of pizza, having been from New York. At the sessions, yeah, I think where I end up the last few years spending a lot of my time is at the Health Tech Pavilion, not surprisingly. And I think it gets to, I think, Pat, one of your earlier questions is, how do you get these technologies into ultimately practice and guidelines? And a lot of that is trying to exchange information, right? The idea that retinal imaging can relate to cardiovascular and other diseases is not intuitive until you realize that you're seeing blood vessels in high resolution, and a lot of these diseases start in your blood vessels. But I think the idea that there's a go-to place where the latest innovations and panel discussions can be discussed, and sort of the latest companies, part of the Innovators Network, can showcase what they're doing. I think that really helps, raise awareness of what's here now, what's coming, and I think helps both the companies and the clinicians and researchers. How do you sort of cross communicate and bring more science of companies and bring more, product deployment to all the research and innovation that's happening. So, I think the last point to Kate's comment, imaging, when you think about patients and being able to better communicate with them, I think the Stanford example I used is a great example. There are multiple publications showing patients their own images of what's going on actually is very motivating for improving health behaviors and adhering to preventive or other therapies. So there is a big opportunity to leverage the fact that these are things that patients can look at and not just clinicians. And probably the last plug, I think this whole era we're in of really trying to empower and better communicate with patients, as Pat has heard me, I if you want to go more in depth on all the AI around imaging and digital health, I wrote a book called Fight Heart Disease Like Cancer, very much trying to bring all this science and education, but make it understandable for patients that there's so much we can do using this technology to improve cardiovascular health and cardiovascular care.
Great. Yeah, and so just to wrap up, so really appreciate it. From my perspective, so George, another big event in Chicago is the Chicago Bears, which is our American football, has a home game, and they play their arch rival, the Green Bay Packers, on Sunday. And Soldier Field, where they play, is like literally right next door to the McCormick Place. So there's going to be an interesting confluence of cardiology people and football fans on Sunday. So that'll be an interesting mix. They'll be grilling, hot dogs and bratwurst at 7 o'clock in the morning. So anyway, but that's something to keep in mind. And then, you mentioned the Health Innovation Pavilion. We're really excited about that. We have over 100 confirmed speakers. We actually have 24 individual events going on within our program. So, Scientific Sessions is a big meeting itself. Our Health Innovation Pavilion is done in the Science and Technology Hall, which is the exhibit hall. So that's, please stop by and check it out. Our headlining event is our Health Tech Competition. It's actually done in 3 parts. Mike is one of the judges at that event, but we have 5 finalists. but we have a whole series. We have something for everybody. You know, we're doing a program on pediatrics, another one on geriatrics. We actually have student presenters, and we have people with the title of dean. We have patient presenters, and we have clinicians. We're talking about community health, and we're talking about AI. We're talking about 100 years of innovation, and we're looking at the future. So we really have something for everybody. So we're really excited about it. So I want to thank our panelists, Kate, Mike, and George, for your willingness to participate, and also to my colleagues, Rachel and Jeff, for being the support behind the scenes, making this happen. And thank you, and looking forward to our next session coming up in about a month. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking
Thanks,
forward to
everyone.
seeing you all.
Yep.
Bye.